Three iconic men, three iconic speeches.
Ask what you can do for your country.
And I intend to make that my basis for running and over the period of the next year.
I have a dream.
And three mysterious assassinations.
Who were with President Kennedy say he is dead of bullet wounds.
Major D reported that Senator Kennedy had been shot.
He's been shot?
That's right.
The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39 years old and a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and the leader of the nonviolent civil rights movement in the United States, was assassinated in Memphis tonight.
For over 50 years, the people of the US have speculated and theorized what might have happened to these three larger-than-life icons. Well, in 2025, it seems like we're finally about to get our answers. As soon as he entered office, President Donald Trump signed off on an executive order to release the JFK, RFK, and MLK files in their entirety.
Sir, we have an executive order ordering the declassification of files relating to the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
That's a big one, huh? A lot of people are waiting for this for years, for decades. And everything will be revealed.
Promising to reveal everything, now National Intelligence must present a plan for the full and complete release of all John F. Kennedy assassination records, and immediately review the records relating to the Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. assassinations, and present a plan for their full and complete release within 45 days. However, this does present us with an opportunity to look back on what we know so far about these three legends who permanently etched their names in America's history books, and how they were all removed from their pedestals at the peak of their power. So let's go back to the 60s, when hip-hop, the Beatles, and America's intelligence network were all brimming with influence, just so we can understand why, to this day, more than 60 years later, all these incidents are still shrouded in mystery. So let's start with the JFK assassination. In 1961, John F. Kennedy was elected as the 35th President of the United States, making him the youngest elected president at 43 years of age.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of your ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
He was enigmatic and a true family man through and through. But most importantly, he had the people's love who trusted him to do what was right.
We observe today not a victory of party, but a celebration of freedom, symbolizing an end as well as a beginning, signifying renewal as well as change. For I have sworn before you and Almighty God the same solemn oath our forebears prescribed nearly a century and 3/4 ago. The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life. And yet the same revolutionary beliefs for which our forebears fought are still at issue around the globe. The belief that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
But despite all his noble intentions, an assassin's bullet would end his life 2 years later in one of the most shocking and mysterious assassinations in the history of the United States. The mystery surrounding his assassination has sprouted several conspiracy theories and launched investigations into over 100 suspects who could have been involved that day. But before we can get to that fateful day in Dallas, let's talk about some of the context surrounding the incident. Only then will we be able to understand why some of these conspiracy theories actually have a lot of merit. As we know, John F. Kennedy rose through the ranks to become president of the United States in the early 60s. During this time, the US was locked in a Cold War with another superpower halfway across the world. At the same time, the country was also going through a wave of change in other events with Martin Luther King Jr. at the helm. The CIA and FBI, along with some of other intelligence and military organizations, were also in full effect. We've all seen the movies of spies in foreign countries carrying out unsanctioned operations and assassinations of influential figures across the world, all in complete secrecy. Could it be that JFK walked into the system and immediately didn't like what he saw? After all, his idea of world peace stemmed from diplomacy rather than covert operations. Just look at the things the US has been accused of in history's past when it comes to inciting coups in other nations like Cuba and Vietnam. Kennedy sought to put an end to this immediately, firing several military and spy leaders, including the director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, all in an attempt to establish control over these organizations. He also helped de-escalate the Cuban Missile Crisis and ordered the deputy director of the CIA to resign following the organization's failure in the Bay of Pigs invasion.
The assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro. Landings were affected by rebels.
These initiatives seem to put Kennedy at constant odds with the FBI and CIA, which is important in context when you really dive deep into what happened that day in November 1963.
Comes the big jet in. Fire marshals and all following the plane, which is normal precaution. Where the president goes, right into us now. There's Mrs. Kennedy, and the crowd yells, and the President of the United States.
As we already know, JFK arrived in Dallas with his wife Jackie and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson for a speech. He gets the usual reception from the public, who shower him with gifts, flowers, and lots of handshakes as they make their way through Dallas in an open-top limousine with John Connally, the governor of Texas. But as his motorcade is going through Dealey Plaza, multiple gunshots ring out. The gunshots pass through the president's head and neck, also injuring Governor John Connally in the wrist and shoulder. JFK is then immediately rushed to the closest hospital, where he's pronounced dead a few hours later.
A carryover from his war injuries. He failed to participate in the McCarthy censure and vote.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
Within hours of the assassination, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took action, launching a full-scale investigation, which identified the main suspect as Harvey Lee Oswald, a 24-year-old Marine who had previously become disenchanted with the US, declared himself a communist, and moved to the Soviet Union. However, a few years later, he and his family were deported back to the USA. The investigation concluded that Oswald had gained access to the 6th floor of the building where he worked to fire multiple rifle rounds at the president through an open window, eventually ending his life. Despite putting up a decent fight, which involved killing a Dallas police officer, he was found later that same day in a movie theater downtown. But on his way to prison, Oswald continuously claimed that he'd been set up and planned to plead not guilty in front of a jury.
You killed the president?
No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet. The first thing I heard about it was when the newspaper reporters in the hall asked me that question.
By this time, Lyndon B. Johnson had been inaugurated as the next president of the United States, and he immediately ordered the FBI to look into this. However, in just a few short hours, the FBI's director, J. Edgar Hoover, had come up with a concrete conclusion that Oswald was the lone gunman involved in the assassination of JFK. Obviously, it was a bit concerning for the public to see the FBI come up with a conclusion that quickly. But thankfully, they still had a trial to look forward to, where the truth would eventually be revealed. Unfortunately, the trial never happened, because 48 hours after JFK's assassination, Oswald was declared dead after a man jumped in front of the line of reporters and police to shoot him.
Let me have it. I want it. Being let out by Captain Fritz. There is the person. There is Lee. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
The man was ID'd as Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner with no direct or indirect affiliations with JFK. He was eventually convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Oswald, where he died of cancer in 1967. Naturally, the public was very skeptical of the entire investigation and the Jack Ruby incident. So President LBJ, along with Hoover, sought to change the public's perception by appointing the Warren Commission to analyze the investigation carried out by the FBI.
This proposed group that they're trying to put together on this study of your reports and other things, 2 from the House, 2 from the Senate, somebody in the court, a couple outsiders.
Well, I haven't heard of that. I've seen the reports on the Senate investigating committee that they've been talking about.
Yeah, well, we think if we don't have, I want to get by just with your filing your report.
I think it'd be very, very bad to have a rash of investigations.
Well, the only way we can stop them is probably to appoint a high-level one to evaluate your report.
Yeah.
And put somebody that's pretty good on it from that I can select out of the government and tell the House and Senate not to go ahead with the investigation.
Yeah.
The only issue was that the majority of the men the president had decided to place on the commission, including the former director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, had both personal and professional differences with JFK. This commission submitted its report just 10 months later, coming to the same conclusion as the FBI, that Lee Harvey Oswald was the only shooter and neither him nor the man who killed him, Jack Ruby, were ever part of any larger conspiracy. But when the president asked Hoover how many shots were fired, he had a very curious response.
Shots were fired. 3. Any of them fired at me?
No,
all 3 at the president.
All 3 at the president, and we have them.
Now the part you've all been waiting for. The conspiracy theories. This audio of Hoover stating that Oswald only fired 3 shots has been credited as the fire starter for a litany of conspiracy theories over the years. According to Hoover, out of the 3 shots he fired, the first missed the motorcade entirely, and the third went right into JFK's head, proving to be the fatal shot. But it's what the second bullet did that remains one of the biggest mysteries in the history of the US. But that's not the only piece of evidence that doesn't add up with the Warren Commission story. Over the years, the public has learned that they ignored several witnesses that contradicted their story.
Our first investigation will be announced, but it's going to be covering on a thorough investigation into the John F. Kennedy assassination. And I can tell you, based on what I've been seeing so far, the initial hearing that was actually held here in Congress was actually faulty in the single bullet theory. I believe that there were 2 shooters, and we should be finding more information as we are able to gain access into the SCIF, hopefully before the files are actually released to the public.
Ignored several reports from the surgeons and doctors who had worked with Mr. Kennedy immediately after he arrived at the hospital.
When I saw the autopsy pictures, I thought somebody had really tampered with the whole thing, and it made me very suspicious.
Parkland doctors were a serious problem for the U.S. government because they had provided evidence that the president had an exit wound in the back of his head. That means there was a shooter somewhere in the front. And that ran totally contrary to the official narrative of a lone shooter from above and behind.
In order to probe that, you had to go back to Parkland and speak to these doctors.
Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter had just walked into that room ahead of me, and Dr. Perry was standing on the right side of the cart the president was lying on. Dr. Baxter opposite him on the left side. And those x-rays that I've seen are wrong.
I mean, they've done that at the autopsy.
It was a lie. They really didn't tell the truth about it.
and cherry-picked the FBI's evidence to make their case stronger. There was even another committee set up by Congress in the 70s that hinted at the JFK assassination being linked to a conspiracy, discrediting the original commission's verdict. Of course, this doesn't definitively prove that there was a conspiracy. The only way to prove that would be with the unredacted files the Trump administration is planning to release. And hopefully, we get to see everything. But what do you think? For my video I plan to do covering JFK's release files, what are you hoping to see? Also, what is the craziest conspiracy you've heard regarding this? Let me know in the comments below. Unfortunately, JFK might not have been the only Kennedy in the FBI and CIA's crosshairs, because a few years later, his brother, Robert, would suffer the same fate, a mysterious assassination at the hands of a lone gunman. Robert F. Kennedy was determined to go down the same path as his older brother, a path that ideally ended with him becoming the president of the United States. And he got one step closer to his dream when his brother, John, appointed him the 64th Attorney General of the United States. But then tragedy struck when JFK was assassinated in 1963, as we mentioned before. And Robert had to once again step away from his duties to take care of his family. But when he returned to office, he had one goal and one goal only: to take his brother's place as the president and to follow the same values he followed. So in 1965, he started running as a US Senator from New York, with the end goal of earning the Democratic Party's presidential nomination. His campaign was almost flawless, earning him 4 out of the 5 main primaries in the country. And many believed he was the clear winner in the race of the presidency in 1968. Now fast forward to June 5th, 1968, and Robert's addressing his supporters in a ballroom at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles after winning both the South Dakota and California primaries the day before.
We have certain obligations and responsibilities to our fellow citizens, which we've talked about during the course of this campaign, and I want to make it clear that if I'm elected President of the United States with your help, I intend to keep them. All of these primaries have indicated, and all of the party caucuses have indicated, whether they occurred in Colorado or Idaho or Iowa, wherever they occurred, it was the people in the Democratic Party and the people in the United States wanted change. What I think is quite clear is that we can work together in the last analysis, and that what has been going on within the United States over the period of the last 3 years, the divisions, the violence, the disenchantment with our society, the divisions, whether it's between blacks and whites, between the poor and the more affluent, or between age groups, or on the war in Vietnam, that we can start to work together. We are a great country, a selfish country, and a compassionate country. And I intend to make that my basis for running and over the period of the next year.
At approximately 12:10 a.m., he leaves the ballroom after his speech, and that's when it happens. While going through a crowded kitchen passageway, an assassin jumps out from the crowd to shoot Robert F. Kennedy from close range, hitting him in the chest.
Lots of television cameras and stuff, and we were going into a press conference.
He was shaking hands with the 2 busboys, talking with him, and it was at that time that the shots started.
Major D reported that Senator Kennedy had been shot.
He's been shot?
That's right.
He's taken to the Good Samaritan Hospital immediately, where he's pronounced dead after a few hours. Later that night, the Los Angeles Police Department managed to arrest the shooter, who was ID'd as Sirhan Sirhan, a 24-year-old Palestinian who claimed to hate Mr. Kennedy for his pro-Israel stance.
But why did Robert Kennedy, the friend of the downtrodden, become the focus of this hatred?
Because to me, he was my hero. He was my champion. He was the protector and the defender of the downtrodden and the disadvantaged. And I felt that I was one. And to have him say that he was going to send 50 Phantom jets to Israel to deliver nothing but death and destruction on my countrymen, that seemed as though it were a betrayal. And it was sad for me to accept, and it was hard for me to accept. And just all my hopes were focused on Robert Kennedy. I was his supporter.
The investigation into the assassination also conveniently built up the narrative that Sirhan was once again the lone gunman in the shooting. This was, of course, major deja vu for the Kennedy family. More than 50 years later, the public still isn't convinced that RFK's death wasn't part of a larger conspiracy, just like JFK before him. Many have even claimed that the government was involved because they didn't like the stances RFK was taking. For example, Robert, just like his brother, was very vocal about how the war in Vietnam was wrong and how the US military and spy leadership were escalating the situation. He also campaigned against increasing American spy activity in several countries across the world, including Cuba.
Most chilling experience with escalation was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this was the experience in which the world learned something about the means of de-escalation, how to come back down the ladder. I wonder if you could look back at that experience and tell us what was learned there about the means. How do you come back down?
Well, I think you don't place, basically, I think the lesson is that you don't place a major power in a position where their national security, their national prestige is involved. Put them in a corner without any ability to extricate themselves.
He often stood up for civil rights and was about to become the United States' next president. So could it be that some of the leaders within the US military saw RFK as a potential threat to their operations? Especially considering J. Edgar Hoover and his practices at the time. Which is ironic considering that Hoover and RFK were thought to have colluded 4 years earlier in the murder of another influential civil rights, Martin Luther King.
Let me say, as I've always said, and I will always continue to say, that riots are socially destructive and self-defeating. I'm still convinced that non-violence is the most potent weapon available to oppress people in their struggle for freedom and justice. I feel that violence will only create more social problems than they will solve. That in a real sense it is impractical for the Negro to even think of mounting a violent revolution in the United States.
We've all sat in history class and learned about the great Dr. King, from his fight to end segregation in Alabama, the Montgomery bus boycotts, and his fierce push for non-violent protests. His image and legacy has essentially been burned into our brains. The climax of his influence produced peaceful sit-ins in restaurants and church fronts, all in the name of ending segregation in the Deep South. And he was massively successful. I mean, who hasn't heard of his speeches? Now, King's obvious enemies were the usual suspects like the Ku Klux Klan, who had allied themselves with local police in the South and considered it their mission to rid the world of King. There were also several pro-segregation groups like the White Citizens Council, who argued that MLK's movement had communist ties.
I think the progress of the revolution has increased at a geometric rate in the last few months. Particularly since the Negro leaders themselves have displaced white liberals in charge of the entire movement. This grew out of a policy that was adopted by the Negro leaders at a so-called summit conference at Arden House at Columbia University last Thanksgiving, where the entire Negro movement in the United States was identified with the movement for African nationalism in Africa. This is a development of extreme significance, I think, because it opens up the possibility for non-white domination of the United States through three means. One, through the mechanism of the United Nations. Two, through the Kennedy administration's increasing tendency to surrender our national sovereignty. And three, through massive colored immigration, which is favored by liberal elements in this country. It seems to me that this heightened pace of the revolution results from integration itself. Well, under segregation, there was no such disturbance as this.
But among his greatest threats was the then director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. In August 1963, the FBI's director started taking a massive interest in the civil rights movement, mainly because he believed the movement had communist roots. And with King gearing up for a massive protest in Washington, D.C., this was the best time to figure out if there was any truth to those beliefs. So Hoover tasked an agent, William Sullivan, to oversee an investigation into MLK's organization and find any evidence of communist influence. A few weeks later, Sullivan submitted his report stating that although the communist regime had tried to infiltrate the civil rights movement, MLK had rejected it. The exact words of the report were, "Despite tremendous sums of money and time spent by the Communist Party USA on the American Negro during the past 44 years, the party has failed to reach its goal with the Negroes." The director on January 26, 1960 said publicly, "To lure our Negro citizens into the party, despite every type of propaganda boomed at our nation's Negro citizens, they have never succumbed to the party's saturating promises of a communist utopia. This generation and generations to come for many years owe a tremendous debt to our Negro citizens who have consistently refused to surrender their freedoms for the tyranny of communism." But for Hoover, this conclusion was unsatisfactory. He wrote his own comments on the report stating, "Communism's influence on King isn't infinitesimal." You see, Hoover wanted his agents to conclusively prove that King was connected to communism, so he could get permission to wiretap his home and hotels to get some much needed dirt on him. And Sullivan realized that, making him amend his report to appease Hoover. This new report stated that the Communist Party had substantial influence among the black community in America. This report came out 2 days after King's now legendary speech in Washington.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
But it gave Hoover all the ammunition he needed to get permission from the Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, to wiretap King everywhere he stayed. Unfortunately, the government hasn't released any of these audio recordings yet, and it's unclear if they'll be a part of the files Trump has promised to release. For now, we only have the agent's interpretation of those audios to rely on, and considering it's the FBI, we don't know if these interpretations are reliable. And now we come to the most controversial of the reports surrounding MLK. The agents monitoring King's communication reported that he was a serial womanizer who would get excessively drunk and parade naked around the halls with his girlfriends and prostitutes. For Hoover, this was the best news he could hear because it gave him the ammunition to hurt MLK where it hurt most: his moral high ground. The goal was to knock him off his moral pedestal, and when MLK announced he was bringing his movement to DC again, Hoover decided to play his cards. In a blackmail letter that has since been found in the FBI's files, Hoover asked King to take his own life in the next 34 days or the incriminating audios would be released to the public. But Dr. King didn't back down, and he was resolved to carry on with his march in DC. But a day before his march on Washington, on June 4th, 1968, King was shot in the jaw while standing on the balcony of his hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. He was then taken to the nearest hospital where he was pronounced dead. This was the last speech he gave before his assassination.
I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The investigation the FBI launched to find his killer was haphazard and unorganized. According to the reports, the shooter was James Earl Ray, 40-year-old fugitive who had escaped from the Missouri prison just a year earlier. Apparently, this fugitive, who had been on the run for a year, had managed to flee to Canada, then England, then Portugal, and then back to England, where he was caught trying to board another flight. He was then sent back to the States, where he was arrested for the murder. And coincidentally, Ray decided to plead not guilty as well, declaring that he had been set up for the murder, even going as far to say that there was this one giant conspiracy.
So you heard the news on the radio? Is that the way you heard it? So you were driving, you left that gas station at 2nd and Linden, what, about 6 or?
I don't have any way of knowing. I think it's around that time, but I don't even know if it's Linden. I know where the approximate area it is. And I've seen the map on the Enquirer.
And you were going back to pick up this man that you say is Raul?
No, I just waiting the car back.
So you heard all this confusion, turned and flipped on the radio. They said Dr. King's been shot. Did you think you were set up at that point?
No, I was headed toward New Orleans when I had the radio on. I used to keep the radio on. I think I didn't have too strong feelings about the shooting.
Now at this point, the similarities between both MLK and JFK's killers are getting hard to ignore. Even the House Select Committee that had been set up just to investigate these two murders concluded that MLK's assassination, like JFK's, could be part of a larger conspiracy. And when you consider how many holes there are in the actual investigation and how many witnesses there are that can contradict the official story, plus the weak explanation for how a 40-year-old fugitive was able to escape through 3 countries after expertly killing MLK in one shot, you begin to wonder if the government's been lying to you all along. However, without the rest of the files that the Trump administration is set to release, there really is no way to find out what happened. All we can do is hope that those files reveal the complete unredacted truth of all 3 of these assassinations.